I don't know what to do. Seeing James after so many years was, in and of itself, disturbing, but the information he gave me chills me to my core. I thought my 10-year high school reunion was going to be just a fun night of dancing, drinking, catching up, and reliving some crazy times with some old friends. Initially, the night was just what I'd hoped. Some people even reminded me of some old stories I'd forgotten about. As the night went on, we settled into a table with our old friend group. We got a few drinks into us, and the topic of conversation eventually came around to the people who couldn't make it that night. Most of them were just busy with work. Some had left the country with no plans to return. Some were no longer with us at all, like James. As soon as his name was mentioned, the mood shifted noticeably. It was a gut-wrenching story. James, our good friend until 11th grade, had killed himself in the very gymnasium in which we had gathered. I could go on for a long time telling stories about him, but what really remains with me was the warmth and excitement you get when you saw his big afro bouncing down the hall towards you over the heads of all the other students. His locker was right next to mine, so I got the pleasure of his company multiple times a day. He had been so bright, so larger than life, it was inconceivable to us that he had that kind of torment brewing inside him. There were no signs, no recent major trauma or loss in his life, no drug use, nothing to warn us. It absolutely devastated the friend group, especially the sweet, lovely Rita, my now wife, who at the time had been working up the courage to ask him out after a long crush. They were an obvious choice for each other, as Rita was more of a typical cheerleader from a middle-class family, and James was an art student from a loving but difficult home situation. But stranger things have surely happened. As soon as Rita told us her intentions, it was as good as done. Rita was a hard worker who always got what she wanted. Leanne broke the silence first, raising her glass. We followed suit, toasting the memory of our long-gone friend. The night went on, and slowly people started to drift off to walk around the halls. My wife and I held hands and meandered through the courtyard, taking in the sense of the warm summer evening. The outlines of people floated across the windows of the building as others wondered as we did, except one figure who stood completely still in the window of a hallway. They were either staring straight at us or had their back to the wall. I couldn't quite tell, but the silhouette seemed willowy, not like the fuller outline of an adult, more like that of a teenager. And one thing caught my attention so strongly I nearly choked. The figure had a large afro. Rita, sensing something was wrong, looked to me and asked if I was all right. I reassured her, saying I was fine, but nonetheless was going to go find a washroom. I re-entered the building, and instead of heading for the men's room, I instinctively made my way to my old locker. I didn't see any figure, but the air was noticeably colder. I made my way down the hall slowly, carefully, listening intently for anything amiss. From behind me, there came a sound like wind. I turned, and there he was, faded like an old picture, but it was him, my old friend. His mouth was moving, but the sound was distant and muffled. Even still, I could read his lips. He was shouting my wife's name. Shocked, I told him to wait there, that she was here. I would go get her. But before I could even turn to leave, James shook his head vigorously. I stopped, mystified, and watched as he again said my wife's name and drew his finger down his wrist, mocking the fatal gashes that ended his life. The air in the hallway suddenly seemed warm compared to the icy cold that filled my veins. It couldn't be. I shook my head slowly, not believing what was happening. Rita killed James? His image started to fade. I lunged toward him, pleading with him to wait. He whispered one last sentence, and it all made sense. He said that he said no when Rita asked him out, and suddenly he faded entirely, and I was alone in the hallway. But only for a moment, as Rita rounded the corner to where I was. In the same sparkling tone of voice she always had, sounding strange and far away to me now, she asked me if I was ready to head out. I nodded numbly. I didn't want to go with her now, but with James' voice still ringing in my ears, I knew better than to say no to her. My name is Mirabelle. I am Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, as well as Irish, and I am an elder in my community. Several years ago, I was speaking to students at a local elementary school about my culture and the history of our two peoples, settlers and First Nations. It is a tough topic, made tougher still to speak about in a way that young children, exposed to it for the first time, would understand without being too upset. It was hard for me to do it in this particular place, as the land on which the new Catholic school sits once hosted a residential school, which some members of my family attended and never returned from. I had not yet decided whether or not I will include this information in my talk. My Irish-Canadian relatives had said that the ghosts of the children probably haunted the land here still, their spirits restless from the torment they endured in their short lives. My Ojibwe traditions carry stories of something like those ghosts, but it was not quite the same as the way my European family described it. Still, spooky is spooky, no matter what tradition it comes from. I was led down the hall to a conference room where I was to wait to be called in for the assembly. The administrator hosting me made pleasant small talk on the way. We passed an open door to a room with the lights off, when suddenly the hallway became dark and the room beside us filled with light. The administrator gasped, and I was startled as well. Then, just as suddenly, the reverse happened. The hallway once again became lit, and the room went dark. I was intrigued, but the administrator seemed somewhat shaken, though she tried to hide it behind her professionalism. She laughed dismissively, and sarcastically joked that it must have been the demon. I was even more intrigued, and asked her to explain. She sighed, but told me how some of the electrical work must not have been installed properly, since the flickering we just saw was not an isolated incident. Lights would flicker, the PA system would randomly activate by itself, etc. Apparently, the children decided that a demon, not just a ghost, a demon, was to blame. This same demon was apparently also responsible for throwing paint at the school's in-house priest. I snickered, thinking of my own kids when they were young who also blamed their misdeeds on invisible beings. She did give the kids some credit, though. She was aware of the building's troubled history, and had herself experienced the sound of drumming on a desk, along with what she said sounded like wailing. She reassured me that the contractors told her it was likely just the pipes. Something about her phrasing had me raising an eyebrow, though at the time I couldn't quite say why. We reached my conference room, and she left me to myself so I could prepare for my presentation. I opened the window and prepared to smudge. I lit the herbs and waved the shell over the smoke, fanning it over myself. I hear something off to the side, something like a whimper, and turning towards the sound, I saw a little boy. He had short, dark hair, shining bangs laying across the top of his forehead. He was clearly indigenous, fully so from the look of him, wearing what looked like a child's version of Euro-American farming clothes, overalls and a shirt with boots that looked too big for his feet. His expression was troubled, and he stared longingly at the herbs smoking in their vessel. I wondered where he came from, but I could feel the strong emotion rolling off of him, and decided not to return him to class just yet. I turned towards him, and began to demonstrate how to waft the smoke over the body, but he reached out and began to do it himself. I could see tension leave his little shoulders, and his face softened as his eyes closed, savoring the smell of the sage and sweetgrass. We completed the ceremony, and he smiled at me and left. Seconds after, the administrator returned to fetch me for the assembly, where I gave my presentation. I couldn't stop thinking of that little boy and the relief on his face as he smoothed the smoke over his limbs and chest. As I left, I saw him once more, standing near the front door of the school, his pudgy hand on the light switch, flicking it up and down. The administrator glanced up, but didn't seem to see him. He giggled and ran out the door. Chi-miigwech. He called over his shoulder. I trotted after him, but once I passed through the doors, he was gone, and the smell of sweetgrass drifted past me. As a primary school teacher, even when I was new, I was very accustomed to the little ones absolutely wrecking things. Trashing bathrooms, tearing up the playground, destroying new pairs of shoes in less time than it took to pick them out. When kids get curious, absolutely nothing will stop them, not even property damage. So when I saw the giant swatch of paint chipped and torn off the wall no higher than a 6-year-old could reach, I just sighed. The building itself was very old and hadn't had many repairs since the 40s. This wall had been repainted many times, out of necessity, but to my knowledge never stripped down to the concrete blocks, so there were many layers of paint that had been made visible by the tiny, destructive hands that tore the paint off. I was pretty impressed, really. From what I could make out, at least 4 layers had been chipped off. The kid must have employed some tools to get the job done. I went to file the work order with maintenance and went on with my day. But by the time the painters actually came in, even more paint had come off the wall in the same spot. We had searched through the kids' toys and any other chipping implement they could have gotten a hold of, but nothing seemed out of sorts, and the kids truly didn't seem to know anything about it. Usually they're pretty bad liars. The painters had barely set their tools down when a paint bucket was violently knocked over. All of us, myself and the painters, were frozen in place in the hallway in the oldest part of the building. Slowly, one of the painters moved toward the bucket to set it upright, when we heard the sound of a hand slapping and a loud no in a young person's voice. The painter drew his hand back as if he'd been struck. We all looked around, trying to find the source of the voice, but nothing further seemed to happen. The painters decided to try to get to work, but when we returned to the wall to be painted, there was a little girl there. She stood completely still, staring at us. Her outfit was rather dated, resembling a costume from the 1930s with little bows at the end of her two braids. Once again, frozen in spot, we stared each other down. Finally, she broke eye contact to look pointedly at the wall, then back at me. I cautiously raised my hand and pointed to the wall. To confirm that that was why she was here, she nodded, her expression slackening into sadness. She reached into the pocket of her dress, showing us a torn-off label that read Dutch Boy along the top. The brand of paint, I figured. The writing looked to be early 1900s style, a thick cursive. The logo was of a little boy with what we would now call a bob haircut, waving a paintbrush in the air. Below the brand name, the words White Lead were printed in capital letters. My stomach sank, and I turned to the painters. The older one seemed to understand immediately, his eyes welling ever so slightly with tears. He turned to his toolkit and pulled out a paint chisel and hammer, showing them to the girl for approval. She seemed pleased by his actions, smiling so widely we could all see the small black crescents where her teeth met her gums. What I found out later was a telltale sign of lid poisoning. Then she turned down the hall, skipping away, vanishing before she reached the corner. The sound of her skipping, however, carried on. The painters informed the school maintenance department of the lead risk, and all the walls were tested to ensure no further contamination, and thankfully there was none. I frequented the wall as they carried out their work, mostly to chat, but honestly, I was hoping to see the girl again, hoping she was supervising the work she ensured would happen. Among all their tools, one set never moved from their place on the stool at the edge of the work site, a tiny toy paint chisel and hammer, hand-painted in bright colors. Sometimes I can still hear her skipping around the halls. So which of these 3 stories did you like the most? Make sure to like and subscribe for more spooky stories.